Thank you all very much for coming in our last week of term. And we're very, very happy and privileged to have Mr. Sejko, the governor of the Bank of Albania and chairman of the supervisory council from February 2015, has been the governor. Mr. Sejko has graduated from the Faculty of Economics at the University of Tirana, and then he did his master's at the University of Glasgow, and also his thesis was on transition economics. And then he's been working in various positions with a long experience in the banking sector. Started as the head of credit division of the National Commercial Bank. Then after that he worked for Deloitte and Touche, and then at the American Bank of Albania, and then in a number of other managing positions, and in July 2010 until February 2015 he was a deputy general manager and head of retail department and branches network for Societe Generale Albania, after which then he became the governor of the Bank of Albania. So plenty of experience here. We're really happy to have you. Now let me just give you a couple of words regarding the institution of the Bank of Albania, because we've been, as SISOX, cooperating with this bank for the last 6 years. And I have to say also from my personal experience, because we've been going there every year for an annual conference, which is one of our highlight events. SISOX, it's a model environment and very successful, not just in its goal on monetary policy and price stability, but also in terms of research and education. And one of the very interesting things that this bank is doing for Albanians, and especially young Albanians, is to educate them regarding the significance of money and the monetary policy in life. And they have also created not just a fabulous building in the center of Tirana, but also a very nice museum where they educate people. So it's not just the Bank of Albania for itself and for price stability, but it's also regarding education. And in that respect also, I have to say that we as SISOX have established a model cooperation with the Bank of Albania for the last 5 years. It's been really productive, very fruitful in terms of the output, in terms of conferences and brainstorming meetings and workshops, in terms of output and publications, books, as well as reports. And we've been actually monitoring and looking at the political economy, not just of Albania, but also the region and Europe, and how the European political economy affects the region. There is a very big regional perspective in that. And it's been very interesting and important for us, because it's been through the period of crisis too, and all the challenges. And we've been discussing them and producing really, really interesting stuff. Maybe for the first time we can start talking about growth and how sustainable the growth prospect is. But in the meantime, we're really keen to listen to the governor today, talking about the challenges and the prospects for the Albania and the region. Welcome, and it's very nice to have you here with us.
Thank you, Othan. It's very nice and pleasure for me to be here with you. I will try to go briefly in the presentation and try to be as less boring as possible, because sometimes the central banking becomes boring, but it's important to explain some phenomena and trends that we are facing. I will intend to present the Southeastern Europe facing the crisis, the elements and the phenomena of the crisis, the financial dynamics. And then after the Southeastern Europeans, I would like to talk about Albania briefly, and then we'll explain and talk about the policy constraints and the reaction that we have done as authorities towards the difficulties of the policy constraints and the measures taken, how to improve. And we will summarize at the end. There will be talkings about the central bank role, but not only the central bank role. We will be seeing things a bit more wider, including all public authorities' role and with relation to structural reforms and all the phenomena. But Let's start first with the main points about the financial dynamics and the crisis effect in the southeastern Europeans. So the main points that I would like to talk about the southeastern Europeans are regarding to, first of all, the southeastern Europeans, all countries are Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, Macedonia, Fyrom, as is used. They have two names. And then there is also Croatia and Slovenia upper, but we'll talk mostly for the region, which is further down. The southeastern European is closely integrated with European Union. Economic and financial integration of the southeastern Europeans in the beginning, before the crisis, let's split the time before and after the crisis. Before the crisis of 2008, were benefiting and were growing and were having quite a good economic prospect. But after the crisis, there were definitely shocks. There were also negative effects. Crises in general were similar for all the countries, but however, there were also differences country by country, despite of similarities. And there were different constraints and institutional setup needed for each country to face the crisis situation. There was a strong economic and financial integration with European Union, but however, this European integration with European Union for South and Eastern European experienced a period of strong economic performance before the crisis, as I mentioned, and also a clear deceleration after the Great Recession. And the graph shows for all the countries the GDP trend, the performance of GDP in Western Balkans, the GDP trend, and you see that the hit is exactly at the year of 2008 for all the countries. However, I would say it's good to mention that for Albania, in the beginning of the crisis, in the year 2008, we thought that we will not suffer at all from the crisis because we had the idea that we were less integrated. Since being less integrated than other countries, we thought that the crisis will not affect, but definitely in a period of 1-2 years later, we experience exactly the same phenomena that the developed countries faced in the European Union. This graph shows the effects of the rapid credit growth and subsequent decline, always in the context of the before and after the crisis. And we have here all the countries of the southeastern Europeans, like Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, and Serbia. Obviously, I mean, by the graphs, it's shown that Albania had the highest effect in credit growth during the years before the crisis. Let's say between 2000 and 2008, there was a rapid credit growth, a tremendous credit growth. But at the year 2009-2010, the credit growth, as we can see from the graph, started to decrease a little bit. This credit growth produced also non-performing loans that we will talk later. But in other countries as well, we can see the same phenomenon that the credit growth was suffering. The outstanding portfolios of all the financial systems were not growing the same after the crisis. The crisis had a negative cyclical effect on our economies. Also, first, prevailing negative output gaps on account of reduced aggregate demand. And we can see here the negative output gap. We can see output gap for southeastern Europeans and also the inflation trend. And as well the output gap of production became negative after the year 2008 for all the countries, and now it's picking up because the economies are improving. Somehow we have some positive indicators and there is a little turn in our growth. There is some moderated growth that we do intend, but however, for the period of the crisis, let's say for the year 2008 and up to 2013, there was a suffering period, and as well inflation went down because, as we know, this crisis period was characterized with a low inflation. If other crises before, central banks and public authorities were facing the high inflation rate and were fighting to decrease inflation, now is the contrary. I mean, inflation was down, was low. There were disinflationary pressures, and the central banks and the public authorities were fighting to raise inflation. Our inflation target, I will mention later, is 3%, and we are at the level of 2%. is the lowest minimum level of inflation, and the target is between 2 and 4, and we intend to have the 3% inflation target. By the way, the central bank, by law, the main primary target has the inflation, the price stability. So inflation is our major target, and the interest rate policy is the main instrument, the major instrument that we are using to control inflation. But there are also macro-prudential policies that we will see later. The lower inflation rates I just mentioned on account of negative output gaps and disinflationary pressures from the EU. Of course, it's seen by each country, as I mentioned regarding inflation. Albania and all the countries, Serbia mostly, suffered in terms of inflation. Inflation started to drop. Inflation performance for selected countries is shown here. There were, in terms of inflation, these effects or these shocks were mostly coming from the external shocks. Inflation was affected first from the low consumption internally, but as well from the shocks of external. Let's say mostly in our countries is impacting the fuel prices, and mineral prices and food prices as well. But fuel and mineral prices are where we are also mineral exporters and fuel exporters as well. As I mentioned previously, we as well had higher NPLs across the region, non-performing loans. As we had a very rapid credit growth before the crisis, of course, we will suffer by NPL suffer. The economy, there was quite an optimist time in all economies, so financial institutions, banks, were very optimistic and not very careful in respecting of the risk criteria when they were generating loans. So basically, all the countries were facing the NPL situation, and our country, especially Albania and Serbia, were the worst countries in the region in terms of NPL, but any country is having an NPL issue. This is even wider element. It's not only in this region. We see that NPLs are problematic nowadays, even in Eurozone, and there are NPL situation problematics in Baltic countries and wider countries. I mean, talking with my colleagues from central banks in different conferences, it's a headache. NPLs are becoming a headache, not only because they produce losses. It's not the issue of loss production for the financial institutions and banks, but the point is that they create pessimism in the decision-taking processes. The life does not continue as normal in the banks and financial institutions when they see that they have high NPLs, because usually the credit committees and top management does not take any more the decision because they are suffering, and by not growing the lending portfolio, the NPLs will continue to grow. I mean, being more conservative than necessary does not correct the NPL situation. It has to be conservative, but the life has to continue and the lending has to continue. Otherwise, everybody will be in a vicious circle. There was also, the crisis has impacted unemployment. Unemployment per country in the southeastern Europeans is shown clearly. Albania as well suffered from unemployment. We have a high unemployment level. There are also countries with very high unemployment levels. I mean, currently, we managed to improve a bit the unemployment, but we went up to the level of 17.2% in terms of unemployment 2 years ago, and now we are dropping. Unemployment this year is going at the level of 14%. Still, it's a very big challenge, and unemployment is an issue for all the developing countries and for all southeastern Europeans. It needs to have job and to have a very alive job market. It's a result of the economy. I mean, having problematic economies sometimes is very difficult to generate jobs. We were talking with colleagues before coming here in the coffee as well about the unemployment and about the students that studies abroad and does not come back and so on because of the job opportunities. The crisis had also structural impacts in our economies, reducing our potential growth rates. We can see per each country the real GDP growth. We can see how sharp was the drop in GDPs for all the countries. Serbia had the sharpest GDP drop, but as well Albania and all the countries, Macedonia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Herzegovina. Before the year 2008, we were, because this is in average for periods, but in maximum we were about 6.5 until 7% GDP growth in the best year. and we were up to the level of 1% GDP growth in the year 2013. Undertaking certain structural reforms that I will talk later, we were able to manage to pick up again in GDP growth. Now we close the year at the level of 3%, 3.5%, and we do intend to close this year, 2017, between 3.5 and 4% GDP growth. But we will see. We have elections. There are many elements. Eurozone situation will impact. So we have to see. As well, we had the declining of total factor productivity and structurally lower investment rates. This is definitely a consequence of difficulties in the economy and the life. So the main points, now let's talk about the Albania. So that was somehow what I spoke about, and the slides is presented was about the situation in all the countries in Southeastern Europeans and the phenomena for all the countries. Now I will talk a bit briefly more concentrated in Albanian economy, which is not different much from all the other countries, but these are our consequences. So the crisis was transmitted in Albania mainly through financial and expectation channels, of course. The crisis posed strongly cyclical challenges to macroeconomic, monetary and financial stability. Also highlighted structural problems in terms of unbalanced and unsustainable growth model, and high public debt and rising NPLs. As well, we had a high public debt, and the public debts continue to raise up to a year ago at the level of 71%. In this context, designing an appropriate policy response was extremely challenging. So, facing all these problems and all these difficulties posed a need to Albanian government, to central bank, to really address carefully to the economic model and undertaking certain structural reforms. The crisis transmission in financial sector, deterioration of financial conditions and tighter regulation across the EU countries induced deleveraging among the European Union headquarter banks. What happened was that the crisis was transmitted from US to Eurozone, from Eurozone to Southeastern Europeans. All the banks, all the financial institutions, we all know, that were suffering. I mean, these financial difficulties, were not only in Southeastern Europeans, but were mainly in European countries, in Western European countries. And especially the financial institutions were facing the different situation and different realities before and after the crisis. As all the optimism before the crisis made them growing, they were in the race, and it's very tough competition to grow and to earn more. I mean, the expression "do more" became a more frequent expression in all the financial institutions around the world. In any board meeting, the expression "do more" was used very frequently. So people were lending. So after the crisis, the deleveraging process was imperative. They were obliged to start deleveraging, start to decrease. Cost cutting became now, from doing more, from generating business, everybody turned on being conservative and starting to deleverage. So this deleveraging definitely influenced in the lending in the Southeastern European economies. Also, the deteriorated financial conditions brought the tighter bank lending standards. Immediately after the year 2008, all the European banks changed the lending standards. They became more conservative, and they put a more risky criteria in terms of lending. This also was another obstacle. So apart from their strategies in lending, so they didn't intend to inject more capital in lending in the Southeastern Europeans. As well, they tightened the risk criteria, and they were also felt in Albania in terms of lending. Also, deteriorated financial conditions brought higher risk premia in financial markets, which means higher financing costs for our domestic agents, and a rapid depreciation of our exchange rates. So if we see carefully the years from the year 2008 to the year 2011, that were the years that we faced. That were the first years that we faced the effects of the crisis. There is a clear depreciation of our currency towards euro, because the country is quite euroized, and that's why we're comparing euro with local currency. And then after that, after the year 2011 there is quite stable foreign currency rate. Even local currency is appreciating nowadays. The deteriorated outlook in the European Union did also affect negatively our business and consumer confidence. So we can see here the economic sensitivity index in Albania and in European Union. Economic sensitivity index, we as a central bank, it's us, the institution in charge, responsible for measuring the sensitive economic index. We measure this every quarter, and this is a very good signal to see the sensitivity and the approach of people towards the economy in terms of investment, in terms of consumption, and so on. So obviously, if we see the graphs, the blue one is the European Union and the red one is Albania, they are very similarly following each other. So basically, they are showing the effect of the crisis per years. But luckily, if we see the blue line, the European Union is growing, the sensitive economic index is showing a pickup recently. So cyclical effect of the crisis in terms of the GDP growth. Given the extensive trade and financial links with European Union, Albania has a strong cyclical convergence to European Union. The crisis in EU represented a negative shock to our GDP. We can see the output gap, direct contribution to Albania. The EU output gap, there is a contribution to Albania output gap. We can see that it turns to the negative, the output gap of production. So this. We can see also in terms of inflation, comparing inflation in Albania and European Union, as we spoke about inflation, also inflation, the red line is Albania and the European Union is the blue line. Inflation is going down, it's picking up recently a bit, so it's going up. So actually during last year and this year, the figures, the macroeconomic indicators are improving. We are talking about the whole periods before and after 2008, it's obvious. And luckily there are positive indicators. We are improving in terms of macroeconomics, but still we are suffering and still there is no clear, yet it's not for sure clear path of growth. We still need to consolidate. We have to see up to the end of this year. This slide shows the NPL performance and public debt to GDP. As I mentioned, all the lending, all the aggressive lending produced a lot of non-performing loans, and we went up to the level of 25%. And we can see the graph that is going down. We did an action plan. There was a clear action plan to address all the problematics of NPLs, and we managed to decrease the NPL from 25% at the level of 16.5%. Public debt to GDP was an issue as well. It went up to the level of 71%, and we addressed carefully to improve the public finances, and we approved the rule Government of Albania, Ministry of Finance, in cooperation with Bank of Albania, we put a fiscal rule that we cannot increase, we can only decrease, and there is a plan of decreasing the public debt. The growth potential of the country decreased, of course, after the crisis. On one hand, the slowdown reflected declining total factor productivity growth, lower investment rates, and skill mismatches in the labor markets. We can see the contribution to GDP growth of capital stock, contribution to labor. We can see, before the crisis and after the crisis. It's obviously shown in the graphic, and economic growth as well. We can see before and after, the trend, how it is going. On the other hand, there is a heavy reliance on the non-tradable sector, and that implied the need for economic rebalancing and restructuring. Our economy, Albanian economy, needed to rely more in industry, agriculture and tourism, and less in construction and trade. Construction actually was one of the main industries before the year 2008. That was from 2000 and 2008. Everybody was investing in construction. Construction real estate prices were growing by 20% each year. So that was the best investment opportunities to invest. So people started not only to have 1 and 2, but 3, 4 apartments, because the one who can get a loan, had incomes enough to justify a loan, the best was seen as the best investment opportunity to buy a third or a fourth apartment. On one side, you can rent the apartment, but the idea is that any time that you can sell, you earn each year 20% more. So basically, that created a bubble. So when the crisis came, it was very similar, like in the United States, what happens with real estates. There was a huge stock in construction. All the largest businessmen were related to construction, and that people were also the main contributor to non-performing loans. So basically 70% of the non-performing loans of the country is created by the biggest businessmen, which were the constructors, or related to construction, not only pure construction, but also iron, cement, and so on. So in this context, it was a need that we needed to reorient and readdress our economy through structural reforms, not only towards construction and not tradables, but towards tourism, industry, agriculture, and so on. This graph shows it's just a trend of the GDP that proves us that we need to accelerate growth. We need to move faster, because with the GDP growth, so slower GDP growth means a later convergence to European Union standards. With the level of the growth we're having, we would need maybe 50 other years, or it's 100 is there, but to catch up with European Union. So we really need to speed up in order to be integrated according to the schedule and the time we have in our minds. So I will talk briefly what are the policy constraints, and then after what is the policy response for Albania. The main points towards the policy constraints are regarding monetary policy, financial policy, and fiscal policy. Albania in this policy menu was constrained because the lack of the fiscal space, first of all, as the public debt was pretty high, there was a lack of fiscal space. There was difficulties in monetary policy transmission, and the difficulties in our monetary policy transmission are related to high risk aversion in the real sector, regarding to deleveraging and de-risking by the EU headquarter banks, as I previously mentioned, and also regarding to the high euroization of economy, because we have pretty high euroized economy. I will show a slide later. That brought a need to integrate structural reforms into our policy reforms. And also there was a limited coordination with external relevant policy makers or regulators. So here very briefly, this slide shows that the credit slowdown appears to be mostly determined by supply side factors. In fact, the supply side factors are related to the offers of the European banks, because most of the banking sector is privatized. Banking sector is fully privatized, and most of the banks are European banks. And basically, due to tightening of the risk criteria and deleveraging, they have influenced the supply. But on the other side, there is also a low aggregate demand. So they are combined. Here is shown that there is mostly by supply side factors. And in addition, this graph shows clearly, the difference between the EU member banks and the local banks or other private banks that are non-EU member banks, the lending growth. The lending growth in the red line is non-EU member banks are continuing to grow in terms of lending, but the EU banks is clearly, the trend is not very, and there is a lot of influence because, as I said, most of the major banks operating in the country are EU banks. Credit is like an oxygen for economy. With a low lending level, we cannot reach the GDP growth we need. With regard to euroization, we do have, Albania has a euroized, although declining, financial system. In terms of deposits, we have 45% of total deposits in euro, and we have almost half of loan portfolio in euro in our financial system. Now, this is this is currently, because 10 years ago, it was almost 80% of deposits and loans in euro, and we are undertaking a de-euroization strategy and plan in order to further reduce the euroization level. This is very important for us because we can increase the transmission and flexibility of our monetary policy first, but on the other side, it can influence as well in financial stability of the country, because loans in euro bears also the foreign exchange risk in the repayment, in their performance. This slide, it's a bit, I will not go in details, complicated, but however shows that how much, what is a normal monetary policy transmission mechanism and what is a monetary policy transmission mechanism in the euroized economy. So if we would have not have this 45% deposits in euro and 50% in loans, in lending, our monetary policy transmission would have been much more effective and much more influencing in growth and in inflation targeting. As well, in this graph, we can see MPL dynamics in foreign currency and local currency. It's obviously showing that the loan performance in local currency is much better than loan performance in foreign currency. It's obvious because loan performance in foreign currency bears the foreign exchange risk. As well, we are following an education campaign to educate people to get the loan in the currency that they generate business. Mostly people generate business in local currency, so it's better to get the loan in local currency, but if there are people that generate business in foreign currency, it's better to get the loan in the foreign currency. Structural imbalances and sectoral overinvestment induced deleverage and balance sheet recession across certain sectors of economy, such as construction. I already mentioned, so this slide does not bring anything new, that construction was the main industry, and now it was the need of reoriented economy towards the other industries. What were the policy response and policy results? First of all, with fiscal space limited, the burden of counter-cyclical stimulus fell on the Bank of Albania. As the high public debt limited the fiscal space, the central bank was keeping the burden of doing. The Bank of Albania policy response was composed of, first of all, an expansionary monetary policy, and as well the macro-prudential policy strived to balance conflicting objectives, to provide macroeconomic stimulus, enhance financial stability, decrease NPLs, and improve the lending environment. On the other side, Albania aggressively pursued structural reforms, designing to enhance growth and growth sustainability and improve transmission mechanism. In terms of expansionary monetary policy, we as a central bank have decreased the base rate, the base interest rate, up to the lowest historical level of 1.25%. We have decreased more than 15 times. I mean, only last year we decreased twice again. We are at the level we don't see the need of further decreasing of the interest rate, and this is done in order to incentivize lending, consumptions, and investments. And there have been a lot of effect, because since we as a central bank have been decreasing the rate, the deposits and the LEC lending has been growing. So there has been a positive transmission of our monetary policy despite the euro-eye situation in Albania. As well, we seek to enhance the financial stability, and for decreasing of the NPLs, we have prepared an action plan, a detailed action plan with the government of Albania, trying to address all the points that can correct the NPLs. This slide is it's like a matrix, but however it shows all the institutions responsible in terms of reforms undertaken, in terms of responsibilities, and the areas that each institution should be addressed to undertake the structural reforms. For the monetary policy, the institution responsible is only the Bank of Albania, and as the Bank of Albania, I mentioned that the price stability is the main objective, even by law. Also, we seek economic stabilization. We use our instruments, inflation targeting, and we seek full institutional independence, as we are independent. While for the fiscal policies, the Ministry of Finance, of course, because they are in charge for decreasing the public debt. We as a central bank are not interfering in the tax model they are following up, but we are advising them continuously, and we are also asking them to reduce the public debt. Other authorities are also the Financial Supervisory Agency, Ministry of Finance, I mentioned, Bank of Albania, also the Government of Albania. Certain structural reforms are undertaken. I will mention later what are the structural reforms, but this matrix shows the institutions, instruments used, and the responsibilities they are having for undertaking certain policies to address to the constraints. With regard to fiscal policy was accommodative early, before the crisis, and even some years after the crisis. In this context, debt finance expenditures infrastructure projects brought accumulated arrears. So basically the public debt was growing and there were accumulated arrears. The public debt went up to the level of 71%, and in the year 2013, when the governments were changed, the new government were facing a lot of internal public debt to repay to the companies that have undertaken the public jobs. So after that, the government started to follow a consolidated fiscal policy. A consolidated fiscal policy, it's obligatory, it's prerequisite to be done in this high level of the public debt, but on the other side, creates a lot of constraint and creates a lot of troubles in terms of growth. In terms of monetary policy stance, we continued with the expansionary monetary policy, accounting for the cyclical position of economy, the fiscal policy stance, and financial stability and strength the transmission mechanism. Monetary policy stimulus was transmitted through policy rate cuts. As I said, we have cut the rate 16, 17 times. Through liquidity injections, as a central bank, we are furnishing the financial market, especially the banking sector, with liquidity continuously. And we are also using the forward guidance. The forward guidance is a new instrument that we are following recently, trying to orient the market in our monetary policy of the future. And this is a very good element to give the finance, especially to the financial sector, but to the markets, what is the expectations and the forecast of our monetary policy for the future in order to reorient them for their investments and business plans. Monetary policy was effective in reducing the financing costs, our monetary policy, because since we started the cuts of the rates, there was a reduction of the financing costs because definitely the rates were low in financing, reducing the liquidity risk premium, preserving inflation expectation, and encouraging the credit growth. Monetary policy intention and the aim of the monetary policy is promoting consumption, investments, and growth, and preserving the price stability. In addition to the monetary policy, we as a central bank were obliged to undertake a lot of macroprudential policies that was restrained by deteriorating indicators. Monetary policy and fiscal and financial policies are complementary and mutually supportive. Price stability is a precondition to financial stability, but financial stability definitely helps monetary policy by preserving a functional financial environment. There are conflicts between monetary policy and financial stability, which are explained here, and we try to address and avoid all the conflicts between the financial stability and monetary policy. This is one of our most crucial points that we discuss in our committees in the central bank. And in all our committees, there are directors and experts, economists from the monetary policy departments and banking supervision and financial stability departments, because sometimes the decisions of monetary policy can influence the financial stability situation, and vice versa. The macroprudential policies undertaken might influence the monetary policy. What we have done in terms of macroprudential policies, first of all, in terms of macroprudential policies as a central bank, we prepared a regulatory package, which was introduced around 4 years ago, to the financial market, to the banking sector, with regard to enhancing credit growth, discouraging the placements abroad, and encouraging the restructuring of the loan portfolio. enhancing the credit growth and discouraging the placements was with relation to the capital adequacy ratio. So, in simple words, the banks which lends more from the growth, the loan growth, the lending growth for the banks that it's from 4 to 10%, we put it less requirement for the capital, for the regulatory capital and for the injection capital. So the banks that lends more had lower requirements for the capital and vice versa. The same for the placement. The banks that have higher placements, we put more regulatory requirements for the capital and the vice versa. That was an indirect instruments to promote lending in the banking sector. Also, in order to enhance financial stability and through regulatory changes, we designed and we seek to correct the unsound lending practices and preserve safe liquidity and capital adequacy ratios. So basically, through banking supervision, we try to regulate the financial market through correct, sound lending practices. In terms of the NPL as well, as I mentioned, we prepared a very detailed action plan 2 years ago. Since I was appointed, together with the Prime Minister, we prepared an action plan, we signed it together to give the necessary importance, we presented to all the factors, and we put the deadlines, certain deadlines, in order to follow up. So there were many actors, like courts, Ministry of Justice, Bank of Albania, Ministry of Finance, Government of Albania. Everybody has to play a role, otherwise the NPL became a real burden for the financial system, and we didn't want to crash and have a higher NPL. As well, with regard to deterioration, we have prepared an action plan recently. This is very fresh, and this action plan is with the intention of discouraging the foreign exchange lending to unhedged borrowers, as I mentioned before, and discouraging the foreign exchange savings by increasing the regulatory reserve ratios for foreign exchange depositors. In this slide, I've just listed the structural reforms undertaken by the public authorities in Albania. As I said, we needed to reorient the economy and have a new economic model, and this new economic model needed to touch all the aspects of economical and social life. And basically, certain reforms has been undertaken in an orderly way. There was, in terms of growth-enhancing reforms were undertaken in education. The education reform was targeting reduced skill mismatch in the labor market. What does it mean is that in Albania, everybody was becoming a lawyer or economist or IT, and that's all. But there is no job for all these lawyers. I have every day 10 requests for lawyers. I have only 12 lawyers in the central bank, and I have no vacancy. But there are lawyers which have studied in UK, in US. They come back, and the most favorite place to work in the financial industry is the central bank. So basically, we need to reorient the education system towards the offer and demand market needs. So basically, there is done a reform. Active labor market policies as well in the labor market, there have been done reform. Judicial system reform, this is the most crucial one, which is very critical, and this is ongoing, and this takes a lot of efforts by the government and influence many areas of life of the country. Financial sector reform aimed at reducing NPLs and decreasing the credit risk. Energy sector reform as well was a very tough reform undertaken in order to collect, to pay the bills, collect and reinvest and invest in the infrastructure of energy in the country. There were also sustainability enhancing reforms like the pension system reform, financial sector reform, and administrative and territorial reforms. I will not go in details in all these reforms because I can speak for hours for them, but as a matter of fact, the intention was that we needed to touch the most critical areas of society and economy that were problematic, and by touching them, we can turn the economy on the good path. In terms of central bank, under current trends, assumptions and policies, we project the central bank that Albania economy will return to equilibrium by mid of 2018, and the inflation will return to our target of the 3% by the end also of 2018. We will follow our accommodative monetary policy until the end of this year. This is our forecast, and this is what we have stated, and by the end of this year, based on the macroeconomic parameters, we are going to revise our monetary policy. In terms of the financial stability, in terms of the banking and financial sector, Albanian banking sector is well capitalized, liquid and profitable. Luckily, we have preserved and we have managed to keep a very well capitalized banking sector. The capital adequacy ratio in average is around 16%. The minimum capital requirement for the capital is 12% in Albania. Liquidity, banks are over liquid, not only in Albania, in all Southeastern Europeans, it's 50-50. I mean, there is a lot of money, but there is a low aggregate demand. There is money in the banks, but there are not good projects to be supported by the banking sector. And of course, the banking sector is profitable, which is a very good sign. I am happy to see profitable banking sector. Sometimes the parliament and some groups of interest are accusing why the banking sector is so profitable, because everybody is suffering and banks are not, but they don't really understand exactly that the banking sector is good to be profitable because they have the deposits of the population. At the end, in the summary, what are the lessons learned from the crisis in Southeastern Europeans and in Albania and policies that we have undertaken? The European Union integration process entails both benefits and challenges, definitely. There are good things, but there are also bad things. When dealing with a crisis, initial conditions do matter. Growth drivers and economic resilience and flexibility should be increased. Financial sustainability helps create the fiscal space. Financial vulnerabilities impair policy options. Monetary policy credibility and efficiency are paramount, definitely. Good economic policy making should be proactive in pursuing reforms, counter-cyclical in economic management and aware of interlinkages. An effective policy response should be comprehensive and tailored to specific country particularities. Definitely, each country has got its specifics and particularities, and our country, we have prepared our structural reforms, studying our country model, but definitely the priorities of the structural reforms are differing from country to country. And last, the policy response should seek for maximum internal and external coordination to achieve optimal effects. So, thank you for the attention. That was the presentation about the crisis effects in the Southeastern Europeans, in Albania, as well of our policies and efforts that we have undertaken as a bank, as a central bank, and as well as a government of Albania, what we have done. Luckily, we have seen some positive results as consequence of all our structural reforms and all our policies. We have seen positive results. Macroeconomic parameters of the country are showing this positivity and this stability. The GDP growth is picking up year by year from 1% to 2, 2.6, 3.5. We forecast 3.7. Unemployment is decreasing. Inflation targeting is decreasing. Foreign direct investments are not in the level that we need, but as a total amount are growing 11-10% each year. So in some extent we are performing. NPLs are decreasing. Lending growth is about 3.2%. I mean, it should be higher. It should be between 5 and 10%, but still there is a moderated growth in lending as well. So in overall, we see, and of course all these parameters are also due to the structural reforms undertaken. In some extent, there is a reflection of the policy measures taken. On the other side, there are external shocks, as I mentioned, that are not in our hands, especially towards inflation. For example, last year we had in the beginning of the year a very drop in inflation from 1.5% to 0.2% 2 months in a row, and this came from the decrease in the fuel prices. But then the inflation picked up later. So there might be external shocks, not only in inflation, but also in terms of financial stability, because many banks are coming, foreign banks are from the Eurozone, and if they suffered like the Greek banks, the 3 Greek banks suffered 2 years ago, and we were really alarming, but the situation was managed and overcome positively. So with our efforts, but also with some luck from the Gulf, we hope that we will pursue and we will continue our growth. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions and discussions. Thank you.